Hi, I'm Kim Mooney with an organization called Practically Dying. I want to start with a Sufi story. Two men sitting in an inn, drinking wine and talking about life. One of them started scanning the room and said, "Look, over there, death. Death is sitting over there, having a glass of wine by himself." The other man caught it and said, "Death, death, we have to escape." Jumped up, knocking over his chair, ran out of the inn, grabbed a horse and started riding as fast as he could towards Samara, the next town. Death, in the meantime, ambled over to the first table and said to the man, "Was that Anos who was just here?" The man said, "Yes, why?" He said, "Nothing, I'm just curious. I didn't expect to see him here because I have an appointment with him tonight in Samara." You know, we all would like to avoid death at some point, but it's not going to happen. And while this isn't a conversation that's going to make you popular at a cocktail party, it's really one of the most important conversations in our life. And death itself can really help us live the lives that we want so that we end up dying with very few regrets. Now, we know that this is sensitive material. It can be highly emotional, it can be triggering, and we know that death and grief go hand in hand. So if at any time during any of these conversations you find yourself a little uncomfortable, that's okay. Just take a deep breath, take two, and then stop and see if you can figure out what's going on inside of you. Because those responses are important moments to help us discover something about ourselves that's really going to be important down the line. Our goal is to give you a sense of death that maybe you haven't had before and some information. For example, that death really is a part of life. It's not separate, and it really informs how we do live. The fact that dying and death can be incredibly simple and they can be very complex, which is one reason we should know more about it. The fact that although it is serious and although it is dark, there is also humor in death. And also that there are things worse than death. So we are hoping that you become curious about these topics as you're listening to us, and that you get to the point where you want to face the idea of death rather than be riding on that fast horse towards your inevitable appointment in Samara. We're going to have conversations that are fascinating with some really interesting people, and we are glad that you are joining us. And we will talk about whatever you want to talk about also. So thank you. Hi, welcome back to another episode of Life and Death, Living Fully, Dying Well. I have two more guests with me today that I would like to have introduce themselves, Gio and Reva. Reva, would you like to start?
I'm Reva Tift, and my business is Advanced Healthcare Directives Guidance. I support people looking at their end-of-life issues, filling out the forms, but also how do they have these difficult conversations with their family.
Thanks.
And I'm Gio Case. I work for a healthcare and hospice agency and also a body worker and shamanic practitioner.
Thank you. Thank you both for coming.
Thanks.
Thank you.
When we left the last show, we asked people if they were interested in doing a little exercise just to kind of break down that big barrier around death, whether or not, we asked them to think about whether or not they were the most afraid of death, dying, or afterlife. And I think that probably that's all over the board in my experience, but I'd like to ask you, when you looked at that, was there anyone that stuck out to you? Because that's really a good entree point for thinking about why you're willing or not willing to talk about this.
I know for me, looking at death, dying, and afterlife, I feel that in my practice, I already have some sort of connection with the afterlife, whatever you define that is. And when I think about death as just the word, there's almost a peace that comes with it as well. So for me personally, the dying process and not knowing what that's going to look like is really the scary part. Mm-hmm. And witnessing different types of death out there, and some are very peaceful, some involve pain, and not really knowing how that's going to happen, that builds up some anxiety for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would agree with you. I think for me it's, I don't know, I think probably the most important thing is what will I do with if I have a lot of pain. That's one piece. You know, a piece that people talk to me about a lot is, you know, whether they want to die alone or whether they want to die with company. For me, that's, I think, less of an issue than having some pain control. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Well, it really, I agree. I think dying is the most frightening part for a lot of reasons, and one of them is that death is a concept. It can be a big exploration for some people. It's nice to sit over a glass of wine and talk about what it may or may not be. I think people don't understand how complex dying is. That's one of the biggest things we've talked about in this show, and actually every place we talk about it, is that people are often surprised at the decisions that they have to make and the choices that they have. Very simple choices. Can I die at home? But when they start to realize how complex the dying process is, the medical pieces, and as you're talking about, the non-medical pieces, that there's a lot around death that's about quality of life rather than quantity, that's where they need, I think, the most empowerment. Because you should be afraid of dying. You don't know what's going to happen. I don't mean with your death, I mean with the dying process. So when I've done this in other groups, that is the piece that comes up for people. But it's helpful because when they talk about death, they realize they're not afraid of death. They're afraid of what they need to learn about most, which is how to have some kind of empowerment in that dying process. So thank you for doing that. I think it's probably true that anybody in the audience, hopefully, has discovered a little bit more about themselves with that also, and with their families. What we were going to talk about this time was not just death, but my death. It gets a little more personal. This is a place where a lot of people go, well, that was really interesting, but I really am not going to die still, or I don't want to talk about it because I'll bring it on. There's lots of different reasons why people, and lots of different reasons, but that magical thinking piece is a lot more prevalent than you would think. If I talk about it, it actually might happen. So what do you think in general stops people from exploring their deaths or their idea of even dying? And what do we mean by exploration? Is it all that we should just sit down and talk about it, take a deep breath and say, I'm going to die, and what's it going to look like? What's in the way, and what are ways that people can just start to open up a little bit?
Well, I think, it's almost requires that we become a student again. This death is a part of our journey. And there's, I think, a big piece about about getting curious and having that be not a class that's one semester where you become a student of death, but it's something that you visit ongoing through your life. We fill out advance directives beginning at the age of 18, and we can revisit those directives throughout the rest of our life and change them. And I think because what we think about death, what we want for death, is different when we're 18 versus 25 versus 40 and so on. Why do people stop? I think people get scared. That's a pretty basic answer, but I think there's a lot of reasons. I'm not ready to die, to follow up on what you said, and if I look at this, will this indeed happen? Well, probably not. That's probably a myth. If I think about something, it will happen. That's a whole other conversation, actually. we could save for later. But I think it's letting ourselves titrate the amount of conversation we can have with ourselves, the amount of genuine exploration we can have with ourselves. Then we can stop, and then we can call it back up again. And maybe we call it back up again tomorrow or in 2 weeks. We call it up by ourselves, we call it up with our friends, we come to a death cafe. There's lots of ways that we should, I guess in my opinion, start thinking about death. But that hasn't been the norm.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I mean, we're up against generations and generations of taboo, and we're trying to handle that individually. And I will honor that in our collective, there's shows like this and Death Cafes that really are starting to make that change. But even looking closer at our individual tribes and our families, and if those people are not in line or supportive of that conversation, it's very unlikely that we're going to have access or positive reinforcement to actually reach out and do that elsewhere. And I think in addition, we often talk about the positive perspectives of looking at our death and the effect it has on the way we live. On the flip side of that, that can be kind of scary as well, because it's then putting responsibility on now. It's making us look at, what do I have to change now? What cycle do I have to break? How far do I have to step out of my comfort zone if I'm really going to start thinking about that time where I no longer have the option? So there's a sense of responsibility and work when we start looking at this, and that could be rather daunting.
Yeah, I like what both of you said about titrating and about trying to get it manageable, to make it manageable rather than, and this is the problem, I think, when people are diagnosed with a terminal illness, is there is no time to learn slowly. But the wisdom of being able to learn slowly and to look at what the culture is also laying on us. You know, we talk about